Hey adapters, I'm Doug Parsons. I'm a partner at Simpatico Studios where we live stream conversations about complex business and social challenges with professionals like yourself who are working on the same issues. Our shows are live streamed in front of a global audience of your professional peers on simpatico.tv. I'm building a new type of online community for professionals like yourself on the Climate Adaptation channel. If you're a regular listener of my America Adapts podcast, I think you'll find that we're taking our conversations about important problems, policies, and solutions to the next level here. And if you're interested in being a guest, we'd love to hear from you. And now join us for this latest episode. Hey adapters, welcome back. Today our guest is Dr. Jessica Hellmann. Jessica is the director of the University of Minnesota's Institute on the Environment and the Ecolab Chair in Environmental Leadership. As director, Jessica provides strategic leadership for the Institute, a mission-based organization working to help build a future where people and planet prosper together. Jessica and I will discuss how nature-based solutions can help humans adjust to a changing climate and how, in turn, we can help nature by making adjustments to ecosystem. She explores a toolbox of options that can help species and ecosystems adjust to climate change, including the legal, ethical, and technical efficacy of these options. Hey, Jessica, welcome to the show.
Hi, Doug. Happy to be talking with you.
All right, yes, this brings me back to my Master's Day. I know we've been chatting a bit about that. But first off, before we kind of dig into the meat of the conversation, can you tell me a bit more about the institute you lead?
Oh, I'd love to. It's an amazing place. It's a real privilege to be able to spend time with my colleagues there. So the Institute on the Environment is a place of interdisciplinary scholarship and leadership development. And we also do a lot of storytelling about sustainability solutions. So we're dedicated to using the tools of higher education to make a difference in environment conservation and all issues related to sustainability. So I get to do my own work as a professor there and be an academic leader. But importantly, I get to participate in this really rich and broad community of people who are working really hard to make a difference and discover the solutions that we need.
Well, for some universities, the institutes are an opportunity, professors and for students to, actually get outside the university. Is that the type of institute that it is? That you're working with policy folks and all that?
Yeah, we were created initially more than 12, 13 years ago to be an interdisciplinary place. So, no discipline. Ecology doesn't own environment. The business school doesn't own sustainability. It's really crosses the whole university. So you need a place that can catalyze and stimulate that interdisciplinary work. But over time, we have taken on more of this mission orientation. So we're working with people outside the university, and we want to use the tools of higher ed, from education to research, to actually contribute to sustainability outcomes. So we're very impact oriented. We spend time thinking about where our time and attention should go that would make the biggest difference. We know a lot of solutions already about sustainability. So research isn't necessarily needed for all things, but there are some problems that we are still trying to figure out. One of them we're going to talk about today.
All right, we're going to get right to that, but I just do want to know that it's great when the institutes really kind of engage the community, because there's so much great work happening at universities, but quite frankly, sometimes it doesn't get out there. There's not the interface to do it.
Well, and professors, we love to profess. We like to stand up and tell people what we know and assume that everyone is listening, and that it doesn't actually work that way. A much richer way of affecting the world is, in having a two-way street, is actually working with people, working with communities, working with the state government, working with landowners in a two-way flow. It makes our work a lot richer when we can connect it to what people need to, what they're actually struggling with and trying to figure out. And by collaborating directly with people in the real world, from industry to government, it's a much more effective path than just writing articles and op-eds and telling everybody what it is that you know.
Well, and the expectation that local planner's reading that science journal, right?
That's right. That's right.
Let's just jump into this, and we'll start it off with a simple question. So what is the duality of climate change adaptation?
Yeah, so and I'm an ecologist by training. I've thought a lot about this question of, well, firstly, I started working on the impacts of climate change back a while ago, where we said, oh, the climate seems like it's going to change. I wonder what that will do to biodiversity and species and ecosystems. So I started studying there. I was really interested in how changing climate or temperature and precipitation patterns and seasonality would affect species and species interacting with one another. That then led me to think about, okay, well, now if we know something about how the system is impacted, we ought to be smart enough to be able to say something about how to prevent or intervene in those impacts. And that led into this area now that we would call adaptation. So what's adaptation are those steps that humans would take to reduce the effects of climate change. And so first I worked quite a bit on what strategies are available for natural resource managers or conservation biologists or foresters to help species and ecosystems tolerate climate change. And so that we would say that's sort of people helping nature. That's one side of nature-related climate change adaptation. But actually, as I've been working on that for some period of time, it's also increasingly apparent, and there are other folks working on the opposite side, which is that nature actually has quite a lot of help to offer us in how we, human systems, need to adapt to climate change. So when we talk about the nature of adaptation, I like saying that phrase. The nature of adaptation is biodiversity, and by listening to and obeying and creatively using the tools of nature to help us adapt to climate change, and also our stewardship obligations to nature to help it adapt to climate change. Okay. And can I say one more thing about that?
Go ahead, importantly,
importantly, we cannot talk about adaptation for ourselves or for living creatures without saying that we really want that climate change to be small. Our chances of adapting to climate change are best when the amount of climate we're adjusting to is small. So that's another duality. We need to stop greenhouse gas emissions to get climate change under control and adapt to the climate that is changing.
Okay, I don't want to go down this rabbit hole, but just want to throw out like a future conversation maybe you and I can have is, as you were describing that, the definition of resilience. And if you like in the natural resource sector versus the built environment, but we don't necessarily need to go down the rabbit hole. But I'm curious, as you've been in this space for a while, in the natural resource sector, I feel was probably one of the early adopters, or even people really thinking about adaptation. And what's your opinion, or I guess what have you tracked? Have they, like, now that more of the built environment sector is thinking about adaptation, which is encouraging, are they talking about nature-based solutions very much? Are you seeing that, or is it still something we have to advocate more for?
Yeah, I definitely, that has been my experience, that ecologists, natural resource managers, foresters started, I don't know, maybe because climate is such an important determinant of biodiversity to begin with, where things live on Earth, how abundant they are, who interacts with what species are interacting with each other. Climate has a huge influence on that. So as soon as we start to imagine that the climate's going to change, ecologists and foresters and grassland managers or whatever start paying attention. So I do think that ecologists were kind of the early creative forces around adaptation. In the built environment, I mean, there have been other themes that have been evolving over some time. A lot of interest in, say, green space in the urban environment as a way for managing stormwater or increasing water quality in the urban environment. And so that kind of green infrastructure world has also started to take on this flavor of adaptation. Oh, that's a tool that can be used to help humans deal with climate change, and that involves nature. So I think there's actually a sort of confluence of these different practices coming together. And as you alluded to with resilience, unfortunately, we do have these different words and terms that we use in different fields. You'll hear this idea of sort of a green infrastructure, or coming out of the engineering world. You'll hear talk about ecosystem services coming out of the ecology world. But we're all converging in a similar space, I think.
Okay, so this would probably help people kind of think about it. Normally, when we think, "Oh, we're going to help nature adapt to climate change," that's a tall order. Maybe that's even
Yes.
a bit arrogant. But like, bring that down to scale. What does that really mean to help nature adapt to climate change?
Well, at first, I think you have a great point. When we say we're going to help nature adjust to changing conditions, that's to the best of our ability. And that's why I think it's so important to point out that we want to keep climate change small, because it's we cannot assume that we have the knowledge, the resources, the time to actually effectively manage systems worldwide, that we will do a good job of conserving biodiversity. I think that's probably not on the table. But there are many things that we can do to facilitate change that nature sort of needs to go through in order to reduce the effects of climate change. We'll probably tend to prioritize those from what we're interested in, because we're the ones taking action. So things that we do, for example, to make sure that we have healthy forests for timber production, or we might prioritize conservation actions for species that are already endangered, or other kinds of ecosystem services or things that have value to us. If I guess my biggest fear is, I often think about, as an ecologist, I think about global biodiversity. Actually, one of my main goals would be to try to save as many species on Earth, to preserve the richness of life to the best of our ability. That may be a bit of a lofty goal, but there are lots of local systems and places and organisms that we could, and objectives that we can do quite a lot to maintain.
So, but I guess maybe you can give an example of something different. I don't know if you followed. Are you familiar with the Wildlife Conservation Society has an adaptation fund? Are you familiar
Mm-hmm.
with their work? So
Yeah.
I was early on. I know Molly Cross. She's been involved with that for a while, and to their credit, they've been really early. I think they've been around 10 years funding projects. And so, but I haven't kept track enough that these are really small scale projects. And I wonder what your opinion is. Like, what are they doing?
So Molly and I actually started talking about this. She was one of the a long, long time ago, because one of the questions was, what adaptation actions would WCS support? Like, what kinds of stuff should qualify? And this has been a really evolving and changing argument, if you will, in our field about what are good actions that everyone thinks, oh, that has a lot of positive side effects, or that would be a good idea anyway. But there are some other adaptation strategies that are a little bit more contentious, or they could have more negative side effects, or they're not things that we're used to doing. So initially, that fund, if I remember correctly, was focused on what we might call those sort of win-win solutions, where they were doing things that were helpful under climate change, but not strong, not using a lot of tools that were outside of the traditional toolbox of conservation biology. But I think they've really come a long way, and are now pursuing much more active management, things that look much more interventionist. So, and I do believe they tend to focus on the relatively small scale. It's sort of easier at that more local scale, is where you can imagine defining, like, what are we trying to achieve here? What are the tools available to achieve that goal, and apply it I guess that's one of the concerns about global biodiversity, is if you stitch all those individual actions together, are they going to be enough to preserve life on Earth? Maybe not, but
It's coming back to me now. I was a reviewer on some of the grants, I think, for a couple of years, but it's been a while. And so you'd get like a small environmental organization, conservation organization. Maybe they're working with beavers or something like that. It's a water management project. And so, like, parsing out what really is the unique
mm-hmm,
original adaptation aspect
mm-hmm.
of this, they were kind of struggling with early on. And I think they've gotten much more sophisticated. I should probably have Molly on doing a
Yeah,
review
you
here
should.
to get kind of a catch up. But I wonder what you think is, I don't want to mention the organization's group, and it's not WCS, but, I was exposed to, it was a big conservation organization, and they had an adaptation shop doing adaptation and trying to bring that within the organization.
Mm.
And they had a lot of trouble with this. And I had this trouble when I was even working for the state of Florida. It's like the traditional conservationists, whatever that might mean, they're like, well, why am I doing adaptation? And so I found that really interesting that this person at this big organization was struggling to try to get all these other people on the ground to like, but to me, being a conservationist and an adaptation should be one and the same now. There should be no daylight between the two. But
well, now to manage in the face of climate change is just part of natural resource management, but that's in large part because the climate is changing, right? This is not a hypothetical, what are we willing to do in the future? This is climate regimes are shifting underneath us, as we speak. So you can't really you can't manage a forest or a grassland or a wetland or a urban park without thinking at least now, climate extremes being more frequent than they were historically. I do think when we first started talking in the natural resource space about adaptation, that was a very common sentiment. People saying, I'm busy. I'm already dealing with endangered species. I'm doing invasive species control. I have development pressures. My budgets are limited. And now you're going to come along and say, I have to do more and extra stuff because of climate change. I think that's past because the hopeful thinking that we could just sort of ignore that and just keep doing what we've been doing before, that ship has long since sailed. But I also think we're much more sophisticated now that we realize that when we are managing for climate, we are also managing for endangered species and invasive species and timber production and all these other things that were important before. We just need to think about how we achieve them. We have new factors that we have to take into consideration. And when we were talking about sort of our evolving toolbox, there were some practices in particular that were very controversial from the beginning, one of which being actively moving species around, or for that matter, a number of things that were more interventionist, like we're going to burn more frequently than we have before, or we're actually going to facilitate and promote the system changing from the thing it was historically into something else, or we're going to start embracing a different suite of species in this location than we would have in the past. So those things, when they start to look different or are different approaches than we would have taken before, that's when that's another time that conservation biology kind of got nervous. Moving things around is something that we were taught you don't do. That's how you get invasive species. But now under a climate change scenario, we're talking about moving things around again. How to navigate and balance the pros and cons of that, well, that's what I was suggesting is one of those sort of knowledge questions that we actually have to figure out.
Well, maybe you could give us an example, managed relocation, and I know there's different terms, but is there a particular species that maybe has been relocated or they're really talking about this? I mean, I don't know. We talked about the key deer, but I don't know if you have a better example that you think would be useful to explain.
Yeah, it's an evolving, it's going to be different for different kinds of species. Frankly, the rules are different for different types of organisms. What are you even allowed to move, for example, across state lines, or, the rules for plants are different for animals, certainly different for endangered species. You can't just go pick up your favorite endangered species and put it in a different spot. There are experiments ongoing for timber or for tree species. I personally would expect if I could glance into the future, I would expect most of our managed relocation to be associated with that kind of highly managed system where there's an economic value. So that's kind of already further down the path. You also are starting to see federal and state agencies developing plans or at least criteria. I was part of a recent discussion and actually a workbook that will be forthcoming for the National Park Service. So the service is actually saying, okay, well, what could this look like for us? Not that they're doing it at the moment, but they're beginning to say, under what conditions would we begin to prioritize or at least be open to this as a strategy? So there aren't a lot of standing examples out there, but we've moved from sort of rhetoric, we're starting to get into practical application.
I think it's happening in your neck of the woods, and if not, I mean, I think Nature Conservancy is doing a tree experiment.
Yeah.
I think right in Minnesota or either
Yes.
Wisconsin.
Minnesota. Yeah. Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
maybe you could
On the North Shore.
like we're going to plant these trees that aren't traditionally here, but let's see how they do. Could you maybe give a little bit of background on that?
Yes, my colleague, and actually she directs the Institute on the Environment on our Duluth campus, Julie Ederson and colleagues, together with some folks at the Nature Conservancy, has been conducting an experiment. So in northern Minnesota, in fact, across the upper Midwest, is one of those places that you'd expect to have a lot of biodiversity change, because the sort of temperate eastern forest comes and finds its northern boundary, and then you have the northern forest, or the sort of boreal forest, they come in contact. And those contact zones are where you'd expect to see the most change, that you would shift from sort of one biome to another. And you're already beginning to see in northern Minnesota, along the north shore of Lake Superior, some changes in what trees are doing well. Some of the more northerly species are tending to fare less well. And that would suggest that some of these more southerly species would and could push into those areas. And where you need to solidify the banks of the shore to prevent erosion or other kinds of ecosystem services, we want healthy forests there. And so they're beginning to test how successful some of these more southerly species would be in those areas. I just think that's really a smart way of doing that, to approach. We want these kinds of experiments, and we want science and research, and we want scholars working with practitioners thinking about these ideas before someone just goes out and implements a program, an official program, if you will, or even takes action of their own accord.
Okay, when it comes to nature-based solutions, I guess I want to talk more broadly about, some bigger attempts to do this. And I guess conservation groups, environmental groups are advocating for these things, but there's a lot of pieces at play, and even infrastructure spending, and what is likely to be some maybe the broader uses of nature-based solutions. I guess flooding would be an area.
So what do we mean when we say nature-based solutions? We are referring to the sort of social and economic goods, usually for people, that can come from incorporating or mimicking a natural solution. And so adapting to climate change is one special category of nature-based solutions. So we could also use nature-based solutions to, say, clean water before it runs to the river in an urban setting. But using nature to help adapt to climate change would include things like including green space in our cities to reduce heat under extreme temperature events, or that cleaning of water, recognizing that we're going to have bigger storm events. And then also we can use nature to help reduce climate change itself by sequestering carbon and storing it in soils or in plant material, for example. And so there have been studies out there that maybe as much as a fifth, 20% of US annual emissions could be sequestered or could be accounted for with these nature-based solutions. In the urban environment, we've done some studies showing that if you use green roofs and you could reduce daytime heat in the hottest days, which will directly confer. We did some studies in Chicago on this, which translates directly into illness and mortality, and also building energy demand. So those are some examples. Now you'll do those when they're cost effective. Actually mitigating extreme heat, where we're talking about lives and people in the hospital and demand on energy supplies, that actually could be a very good economic argument. Another great economic argument is using nature solutions for that storminess under climate change, where your alternative is digging up the street and putting in bigger pipes, which is really, really expensive. So I think usually when the alternative is either very costly or the consequences are really high, that's when nature-based solutions are really going to win out. That's where they'll win first. And then you pile on top of that all the side benefits that we get from those nature solutions, recreation, these kinds of things. That can help tip the scales too.
Okay, so we're getting toward the end of the episode, and I got a couple more questions though, and I want to get a question from the community room. But in my favorite nature-based solution, I'm from Florida originally, and just mangrove forests.
Mangroves.
Sea
Yes.
level rise, like if you're making sure you're keeping those intact, it might actually give you some soil accretion too. It's buying you. It's not, I don't think, buy you for 6-7 feet of sea level rise, but it's buying you some time, and it's use more of it. So it's one of my favorites.
Well, and it will help. It will help for right, those studies sea level rise, but sea level rise is a relatively slow process. What will happen first will be storms and storm surge, and it can play a big role. I mean, actually, there are really amazing data coming out of the big tsunamis showing that areas that had mangrove forest in front of them when the water came fared much better. The people on land fared much better than areas where those mangrove forests had been removed. So
we actually have some people from Bangladesh on our team here at Simpatico, and I asked, because they have that just famous mangrove forest there where a lot of people live too. So it's, I think, been very helpful. All right, here's a question from Mike. Do you think that as we reevaluate infrastructure planning for energy production, that this in turn will also incorporate concern and effort for species surrounding these projects, i.e. solar is far less invasive or harmful than, say, hydroelectric or coal?
One of the things I'm most excited about in the Midwest, and we actually have a paper coming out on this soon. All scientists have a paper coming out on something soon, right? This is our favorite phrase. On solar, utility scale solar in the Midwest. So if you think about what is the habitat, in fact, it's one of the most endangered habitats in the entire planet, our North American native prairie. And similarly wetlands in the agricultural, they were taken out for agriculture. That land was more valuable for food production. Now, as utility scale solar is coming online, those systems are coming. There's the possibility of restoring grassland underneath them.
Wow.
And we've done some studies to compare, just back of the envelope calculations about the pollinator populations that you can sustain, the carbon that you can store, and the extent to which we could restore the prairie. We took the prairie out for agriculture. Now we're going to grow electrons, and we may be able to put the prairie back in. I think that's a pretty cool story about taking advantage of a new technology to advance some of our ongoing conservation interests. And it'll have economic benefits and climate change mitigation benefits too.
All right, this is an ecosystem restoration, but here I moved to Tucson, and what a lot of schools have are just big, broad solar panels arrays, and underneath it's shaded, and that's where the kids play. That's their playground in the really hot summer. It's like, all right, there's lots of stuff you can do underneath that.
Grazing livestock, there's another one for,
Well, you know what, we have to wrap this up. So, I think there's other conversations. I hope we can get you back and have more conversations, but just, I guess what's next for you? What's on your plate for 2021?
Well, I am interested, and we're still working on this question about what's the relationship between increasing solar deployment and conservation. I'm also working on, we're working on some methane work. Where is methane emissions coming from, and what can we do to stop some of those emissions? That's both in the oil and gas sector and in agriculture. And I keep working. I always have a butterfly that I'm studying, and always working on endangered species conservation with students. So I'm doing that as well. So we're working on both sides. How do we stop climate change from being terrible? How do we prosper from the economy that emerges associated with green energy? And also, what are we going to do to confront the climate changes that are here already and coming more?
Indeed. Well, I'm glad you guys are on the job. So thank you, Jessica, for coming on. And I want to take you into just chatting before I let you go. But thanks for coming on Simpatico and sharing the work that you're doing.
Thanks, Doug.
Right back.